So the next step we would typically do, if we just wanted to do some sample locations, or we wanted to simply add an investigation location or a place of interest, you would go into Edit. And if we already had layers set up, you can go into Create and add some. In this case, we don't have any layers yet, so we're going to define some layers under View, under Catalog pane. The catalog pane is where your map layers, your toolboxes, your geodatabases, which is your map project, the default styles and any custom styles you make, as well as the folders for file extensions and locations of where stuff is saved on the computer. To add a sample location or an area of interest, you can open up the database folder and it shows our geodatabase. If you right click on that and go to New, this is where you can add something called a feature class. This can be either a shape, a dot, a line, or anything else that you want to either categorize, name, or identify a feature on the map. So for us, we're going to change this to a point because we're going to put some individual sample locations down for soil sampling and groundwater sampling. So we'll set this to point, and I'll just name this samples. The alias is the printed name that's going to show up on the map itself, and it can include characters such as spaces, unique characters, plus symbols, that sort of thing. For the name, it's just letters and underscores for spaces. And the spelling is the hardest part. So this might take a couple of seconds to load. So what it's doing is it's setting up a new layer. So the new layer shows up in the contents pane on the left side of the screen. This is the current symbol that it's selected as. We can open up this layer, even though there's no dots on the map, and go to the attribute table. And as we add information to the map, this will become populated with a simple point and also general information about the point. We can also add new columns to incorporate information from the map itself. I'll keep the attribute table open and add about 4 points so we can see how it changes as we add information to the map. So now that we have a new feature class open in our contents pane, we can go to Edit and go to the Create tab, and we can select our symbol, and we can put some dots onto the map. So for this site, if this was a site investigation, it would probably make sense to first look at the surrounding area to see where you would expect if something were to be spilled, or if there's an incident that you're looking at, or signs of distressed vegetation. So for this, we're going to pretend that this concrete pad is where a fuel storage would have been placed. So we can put a sample point immediately next to it on two sides, because it should cover most of your bases if there was a spill that came off that pad. And then we can also put a sample location in areas that appear to have distressed vegetation to complete our delineation of the site. So we'll put 5 points. So, and you can see as I added my points, they show up and are populated in my attribute table. So if I want to find what the locations and coordinates of these points are, you don't need to hover over them and write down the number that you see on the bottom of your screen. You can actually have the computer do it for all points at the same time. So first I'm going to hit Save so that it will activate my attribute table. And if you hit Add New Field, this is where you can define what you want the information that's going to be stored in your points to be. So in our case, I'm going to make the first name X, and I'm going to change the data type from long, which is just a long string of numerical characters, and I'm going to instead change it to double. So this will allow me to have numerical characters with decimal points and negative signs. I'm going to add a new field so we can do our Y coordinate. Do the same thing and change it to double. And then for the formatting, I like using the numeric format with the 6 decimal places just to keep a consistent level of accuracy for the locations. But here you can modify it anywhere you want to be. And if you didn't want to do coordinates, let's say you wanted to add in concentrations, this is where you can reduce the decimal places to usually either hundreds or thousands. Alright, so that's good. So now These green boxes indicate that these changes haven't been saved, so you just want to right-click on the green box, hit save, and it should set our new columns in our attribute table. So now we have an X and a Y, and they're not populated. So we'll close the Fields tab, and now we're back on our site location. And so if we click on the top header of the X column, we can right-click this and go to Calculate Geometry, and this is the function that's going to let us assign the coordinate system from our map into our layer. It'll automatically populate it if you put it in as simply X and Y. It'll know which one to sort it as. And then this is where you want to select what data goes into it. So for our X, we want to put our point X coordinate data. For a Y, we want to do our Y coordinate data. And this is where we can select our current map to confirm that it's all in the same coordinate system. Okay, and it should work. All right, so now that the geometry has been set and we have our eastings and northings, or our X and Y coordinates, into our attribute table, now we can export this into other programs and use them for either location purposes. If we needed GPR or a survey done, we can give this directly to the surveyor so they know where the locations are. And we can also import this information into other programs such as Surfer. If you needed to do a surface topography contour map, a groundwater contour map, or you just needed to know the locations of your points for a regulatory agency. So now the next thing I want to do is I'm going to add an additional column, and this is going to indicate what type of sample these are going to be. So I'm going to call this sample type. And the same rules apply for your attribute table as they did for naming the actual layer. For your field name, no spaces are allowed, but for the alias, you don't have any limitations of what you can name it. And I'm going to change this to text. Okay. So I'm going to close my attribute table, and now I'm going to assign a value to these sample locations. So the way to select a sample is you go to your select tool, and you can click attributes. And so now when you click on a sample location, it'll appear on the right side here, and you can type in what type of sample it's going to be. So for these three, I'm going to call these soil borings. And for these two, I'm going to call them soil borings and grab groundwaters, and they'll have different symbols based on their name. And I auto apply selected at the bottom, so once I click off of this and go to the next symbol, it will save the name that I entered in. So now for these two, when you're naming your sample types, because we're going to use them to define what type of symbols they use, spelling and grammar is important, so all of your symbols need to match. So if I put a capital G for groundwater in the first one and a lowercase g for the next one, it would treat this as two separate types of names. So copy and pasting is your friend here. Okay, so now I'll open up our attribute table, and you can see that it's been updated to include what type of sample each of these are and the locations. So I'll hit save. So now, if we right-click on the sample location in our contents pane on the left side, we can go into symbology, and this is where we're going to define what type of symbol. So right now, we're using the single symbol symbology, where all of them are the same. We can then select instead unique values, and any numerical or text value will work for unique values, so we'll select our sample types. And you'll see that now both of our samples are color-coded based on what type of sample they are. I'm going to remove all other values because we only have two. And then in this, if you actually select the symbol itself, this is where we can pick from our library of symbols. These are custom symbols that I use for environmental investigations. ArcGIS also comes with a whole host of default symbols that you can either modify or use as is. But for us, we like to keep it standardized. So for soil borings, we'll use a circle with an X through it with two different colors in the corners. And for the soil and grab groundwater, we'll use the proposed monitoring well symbol just for clarity in this case. So now these are identified as different sample types. It has a description, so now if we want to add a sample ID, it's the same process where you go back to your attribute table, and we're going to add a new column. We're just call this names. And we're going to select text for the type of data it's going to be. And you can either type the name of the sample directly into your attribute table, or you can do it the same way where we select each sample individually and add in its attributes. So this one will be B1. So now each of our samples are now named, and the names show up in our attribute table. So now, typically what we want to do is show the labels on the actual map itself. So we'll right-click in our content pane and go to Label. This turns on labels, but it defaults to the first column in your attribute table. So for us, our first column is simply our object ID, which is 1 through 5, and so that's why 1 through 5 is being displayed. If you want to change this to be the names that we selected, you right-click on your layers again and go to Label Properties, and this is where we can define what type of label we'd like to choose. So in our case, we're going to remove the object ID and replace it with names, and you'll see the names populate on the map. And then for clarity, I like to go to the symbol page and go to Appearance and change the font to bold, and then at the bottom here we have a setting called Halo, which is basically a border around the actual letters themselves. And in the preview pane down here, you'll see how changing these changes what the symbol's going to look like. And so when I hit apply, you'll see the labels update on the page. So now they're much more visible. So that's basically how to put samples onto a map and how to do a sampling plan. So the next step is how to export this type of map into a PDF so that you can include it in a report.